Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. Today, we're tackling the civil rights movement,
Okay.
but through a slightly different lens.
Yeah.
We're going to be looking at two of the most prominent figures and contrasting their philosophies
Right.
and how those philosophies kind of develop.
Absolutely.
So that's Martin Luther King Jr.
Yes.
and Malcolm X.
Two giants.
Wow. I think a lot of our listeners are probably familiar
Yeah.
with both of them and kind of the basics.
For sure.
But I think what's really fascinating is how their early lives really shaped those views.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to start.
Yeah.
It's so interesting to me how different their backgrounds were, and yet
They both arrived
both arrived.
at this place of wanting to fight.
Yes, for racial justice.
Exactly.
But through very different means.
Yeah.
With very different approaches.
So let's start with King.
Okay.
So King grew up in a stable middle-class family
Right.
in Atlanta. His father was a prominent Baptist minister.
Yes. Very much part of the community.
Yes, and active in the NAACP. So,
Yeah.
you can already start to see,
You see the seeds.
right,
Yes.
how that environment might shape someone.
Absolutely instilled in him this belief
Yes.
in the American dream that it could be a reality for Black Americans,
Okay.
and that the system
Yes.
had the potential for change, for inclusion.
Sees the system as
Yeah.
something that can work.
Right. It's not the enemy. It
Ex-
can be reformed.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah.
And then you have Malcolm X.
Yeah, born Malcolm Little.
Right.
His childhood was the complete opposite.
Really?
Tragedy, hardship.
It's almost hard to imagine how anybody coming from that background would believe in the American dream.
Exactly. He didn't.
Right.
He saw it as a nightmare for Black Americans,
Wow.
a system rigged against them.
Okay.
His father was a supporter of Marcus Garvey's Black nationalist movement.
Right.
And was actually killed, possibly by white supremacists.
Okay.
Yeah. So you see the family struggled with poverty and just systemic racism.
So I'm already seeing this connection between his father
Yes.
and Garvey, and then how that leads into...
Absolutely his own ideology.
Wow.
It's like those seeds were planted early on.
Okay, so we've got these two figures shaped by very different childhoods.
Yeah.
And then comes education, which I think kind of further solidifies their
Right.
paths a little bit.
Yeah. One goes the formal route
Okay.
and the other takes a very different path.
So King, he goes on to pursue formal education.
Right.
Morehouse College, doctorate in theology from Boston University.
Good.
So he is surrounded by these,
Thinkers.
yes, these academics.
Yeah. Gandhi, Thoreau, all of these influences
Right.
really shaping his belief in nonviolent resistance, the power of moral persuasion.
So for him, education is this intellectual philosophical journey that leads him to peaceful activism.
Yeah.
Now you have Malcolm X.
Yeah.
It's interesting his time in prison.
Yeah, for burglary,
Yeah. Right. Ends up shaping his worldview in a very different way.
it's a pivotal moment
Really.
in his life.
Okay.
He discovers the teachings of the Nation of Islam.
Okay.
This movement advocating for Black empowerment, separatism,
Right.
a very different
Very different.
trajectory than King.
Okay.
So now you have these two figures who are starting to solidify their approaches to how they see change happening.
Right. So one is appealing to America's conscience, working within the system.
Right.
The other is seeing the system as the enemy and wanting to create something separate.
Exactly. And that's where we'll pick it up next time.
I can't wait to see you then.
All right. And, you could really see those contrasting views
Yes.
in their actions and their speeches.
Right.
You think about King's I Have a Dream speech.
Yes. Such a powerful message of hope and unity.
Right. He really believed in a racially integrated America
Okay.
where everybody would be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character.
Right. The ideal.
Yes, the
Wow.
idea.
And then you have Malcolm X,
Yeah,
whose rhetoric was far more confrontational.
by any means necessary.
By any means necessary. That's
Yeah.
a powerful statement.
It is.
It makes you think a little bit.
It does.
What does he mean by that?
You're right. And it really resonated.
But with a lot of people.
Who felt that King's nonviolent approach was too slow, too accommodating,
Right.
to a system that had brutalized Black people for centuries.
So we have these two contrasting approaches.
Yeah.
Did they ever converge?
Well, that's what's so fascinating is in their later years, both King and Malcolm X
Okay.
underwent some pretty significant shifts in their thinking.
Oh, really? Tell me more about that.
Yeah, so Malcolm X, after his pilgrimage to Mecca in 1964,
Okay.
he started to soften his stance on separatism.
Really?
Yeah, he witnessed Muslims of all races worshiping together.
Right.
And it really challenged his previous belief that white people were incapable of change.
He's starting to see the possibility of collaboration.
Yes, exactly. And his critique of American capitalism
Okay.
started to align more with some of King's evolving views, too.
Interesting.
Because remember, King, while still deeply committed to nonviolence,
Right.
he grew increasingly disillusioned with the slow pace of progress.
He's realizing that winning legal rights isn't enough.
Exactly.
If people are still trapped in poverty.
Right. He saw the poverty
Yes.
and the economic inequality,
Particularly in North.
especially in the North.
Yes.
And this led him to advocate for more radical economic reforms.
So he's starting to sound a little bit more like
Exactly. He's echoing
Malcolm X.
those critiques
Wow.
that Malcolm X had been voicing for years.
Okay, so their paths are starting to
Converge.
a little bit.
Yeah, toward the end. It's really interesting.
And Malcolm X at this point.
He breaks from the Nation of Islam, forms his own organization,
Right.
Organization of Afro-American Unity,
Okay.
which embraced a more inclusive vision.
Wow.
Makes you wonder what could have happened if they had more time.
Right, what if?
Yeah.
What an interesting what if.
Right.
So we've explored their different philosophies
Yeah.
and the ways that they kind of shifted later in life.
Mm-hmm.
But what about their impact? How did they each contribute to advancing civil rights?
Well, King, of course, played a central role in landmark legislation,
Right.
like the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
Huge.
His movement forced the federal government to act,
Right.
and his moral authority really helped to galvanize public support.
And his legacy as this champion of peace and equality continues to inspire people
Absolutely.
globally.
Yeah. Malcolm X's impact is a little more complex,
Okay.
often debated.
Right.
Some argue that his rhetoric hindered the movement.
Okay.
Others say he was crucial in highlighting the struggles of Black Americans in the North.
Right. And he gave a voice to those who felt that King's approach wasn't
Radical enough
radical enough.
to address those systemic issues.
Right.
And his autobiography remains a key text.
Extremely influential.
Yes, in understanding the Black Power movement.
So it's interesting to see how both men, despite their different approaches, made these huge contributions.
Undeniably significant
Yeah.
to the fight for racial justice.
And understanding their contrasting philosophies, I think, is so crucial
Absolutely.
for understanding the movement as a whole.
Yes. And it brings us to the question of historical perspective.
Right. How has history viewed these two figures over the years?
Well, there are various historical lenses through which we can view them,
Okay.
each with its own perspective.
Okay.
Traditional civil rights history often focuses on King's achievements
Okay.
and his nonviolent approach
Yeah.
as the most effective way to bring about change.
The classic hero narrative.
Right. And then you have revisionist historians who argue that Malcolm X's more radical message
Okay.
was critical in pushing the movement beyond just legal reforms
Okay.
and to address those deeper issues of economic inequality and systemic racism.
Right. So they see him as a necessary counterpoint.
Exactly.
Okay.
And then you have Marxist historians
Right.
who analyze both leaders through the lens of class struggle,
Okay.
highlighting how both critique capitalism
Okay.
as a root cause of racial oppression.
So it's not just about race, but the intersection of race and class.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And finally, you have Black Power historiography,
Okay.
which sees Malcolm X as a forerunner to that movement,
Right.
emphasizing Black pride, self-reliance, and international solidarity.
Wow. So depending on which lens you use, you get a completely different
You get a different understanding
understanding.
of their legacies.
It's fascinating.
Yeah, it really is. And it's important to recognize that these are just a few perspectives.
Right.
The study of history is always evolving.
Yes.
Our understanding of these complex figures
Yes.
continues to be shaped by new research, new interpretations.
This is why I love these deep dives.
Me too.
They remind us that history is not just about dates and names.
Yeah.
It's a living conversation.
It's a dialogue,
It's constantly being reinterpreted,
re-examined.
re-examined.
And with King and Malcolm X,
Right.
that conversation is far from over.
Right.
Their legacies challenge us to think critically about race, class,
Mm-hmm.
and the meaning of social justice in America today.
And that is a great place to leave it. You know, it's amazing to think about how these two men born in the same era,
Yeah.
facing the same injustices,
Absolutely.
ended up on such a different paths
Yeah.
toward the same goal. It's
Yeah.
incredible.
And it really shows how complex the movement was.
Yes.
You know, there wasn't just one way
Right.
to fight for equality.
It was a tapestry of
a whole
many different approaches.
Exactly.
And I think King and Malcolm X really represent two of the most important threads
I agree.
in that tapestry.
Yeah. And it's something we're still grappling with.
Yes.
You know,
Their legacies.
do we believe in working within the system?
Right.
Or do we need a more radical approach?
Do we need to dismantle the system entirely?
Yeah. Those are really tough questions.
Yeah.
And there are no easy answers.
But I think
Right.
by examining their lives.
I think that's the key.
Yeah.
Their philosophies.
Right.
Their wins, their losses.
Yeah.
We can gain a deeper understanding of how change happens.
Yeah.
How complex it is.
And how multifaceted it is.
Absolutely. And it helps us
Yeah.
in our own struggles today
Right.
to create a more just and equitable society.
Because we often hear their names invoked almost as symbols.
Oh, yeah.
Like shorthand for these opposing ideologies.
Right. Good versus bad, or, you know,
Exactly.
right versus wrong.
And this deep dive has really reminded me that they were complex human beings.
They were people who
Yeah.
were constantly growing and changing.
Yes, challenging their own assumptions.
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
ultimately,
Yeah.
they pushed each other.
Yes.
And they pushed the movement forward.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into these contrasting philosophies,
Yeah.
I want to leave our listeners with a question. Whose message resonates most with you and why?
Yeah. What lessons do you take
What lessons do you draw from their paths?
from their lives
And how do those lessons inform your own beliefs?
about how to make change,
Exactly.
how to pursue justice?
Because history isn't just a story that we tell.
It's a conversation.
It's an ongoing dialogue.
Yeah, it's about who we are.
Yes.
What kind of world we want to live in.
So thank you for joining us on this deep dive
It's been a pleasure.
into the lives and legacies of Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X.
Two incredible figures.
Until next time, keep exploring,
Keep questioning
keep questioning.
and keep diving deeper.
We'll see you then.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.